From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to Blue Sky, where we share stories and insights to remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. I'm your host, Bill Burke. Words and concepts like optimism and hope have many definitions and mean different things to different people, depending on whom you ask. Another one like this is empathy. And our guest today is an expert on the subject who will not only define this word for us, but also explain why writing and speaking on the subject have become her life's work. Mimi Nicklin is an experienced marketer, strategist, and keynote speaker on empathy and human understanding. This year alone, she's reached over 2.5 million people with her mission to reconnect our workplaces and world through empathy. She's the world's leading empathy advocate and influencer, a full-time keynote speaker, and an internationally best-selling author of 3 books. Mimi has recently shared stages with Bill Gates, Steve Wozniak, and Stephen Bartlett, and appeared on the BBC live to 85 million viewers. She's the globe's leading voice in listening-led leadership and the empathy gap. And as one of her clients once said about her, Mimi is entirely in a league of her own. I hope you enjoyed this Blue Sky conversation with Mimi Nicklin as much as I did. Mimi Nicklin, welcome to the Blue Sky podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, since this is the Optimism Institute, and I like to express gratitude for things, it is quite a miracle. I am in New York, and you are in Malaysia.
We are 12 hours apart. In fact, we are nearly in different days.
Yes, seeing each other and hearing each other, that is a technological miracle that we should not take for granted. And I said you're in Malaysia, but that's not where you were born and raised. Can you just give us a little bit of quick background? Where are you from originally, and how did you wind your way to where you are today, physically and geographically?
Geographically, well, yes, you're absolutely right. I wasn't born here. I'm British originally, but I have lived in Asia Pacific and the Middle East for nearly 20 years. So most of my adult life, I've been working over here. And my most recent country is Malaysia. I've been here for 4 years. I set up my business here. My family's here. We're very happy living in this very beautiful country. But I have, as I said, traveled a lot across the region. So I've lived, I don't know, this might be my 8th country, I think, in the last about 18 years. So I've been very lucky to see a lot of the region.
Were you the child of people who moved a lot, or this desire to move around is something that you acquired later in life?
Yeah, do you know what? I think actually neither, because I think I was probably born this way. My parents were both British. They lived in Britain their whole life. I mean, they traveled for vacations, but that was only it. But if you ask my mother, she would tell you that I was born not to stay in the UK, not to stay in Britain, right? Because really from 17 years old, I left. I think I always knew that I guess it depends what you believe, but that my soul, my energy was on this side of the world, was on the eastern side of the world. And I think it's probably impacted a lot of my work choices as well. So yes, this was all me, but maybe it was a calling. Who knows?
Yeah, very interesting. And I'm wondering too, your background is more in traditional marketing and advertising, and now you are known primarily for your work around the subject of empathy. And I'm wondering if that traveling the world has influenced your view on people, empathy, the things that connect us rather than divide us. Is there a chicken and egg there? Like which came first, the travel and the empathy thoughts, or how would you describe that?
I think the travel definitely came first because I have, as I said, I've been on this road for about 18 years. And that was with my corporate career. So as you said, I worked in advertising agencies, predominantly large American businesses for the majority of my career until I wrote my first book. And I wrote my first book in 2020. And I was in the Middle East at that time. I was in Dubai, which is a very global hub, a very sort of global city. And since then, I continued moving. I spent a little bit of time living in Sri Lanka, which is a small island off India, and then have been in Malaysia ever since. So did the travel drive the work? No. I think, the work came anyway, but I do think that the ability to live within different cultures, the ability to be very comfortable amongst cultures that are definitely not your own. I mean, Malaysia, for example, is an Islamic country, and I am not a Muslim. It's a very open, accepting, tolerant country. But, it takes awareness to live in countries that have a predominant religion that is not your own. So I think that travel definitely impacts my ability to understand empathy, to adapt to many of the clients that I work with. But they're not intrinsically connected, although they do support each other quite well, I think.
Yes. And empathy is one of those words that gets thrown around, and I'm not sure it's always used quite properly, or, sometimes it's even put down as a weakness of late, I've heard. You thankfully define empathy in one of your books, and I'll just read back your definition. I'm assuming you haven't changed it at all, but you say empathy is the commitment to using your imagination to join another person's world with the soul and deep desire to understand them. Great definition. Why empathy? Was there a light bulb one day where you decided this is the thing I want to focus my work on? Or how did you arrive at this interest in the subject of empathy?
Bill, there was a bit of a light bulb actually, but it wasn't a light bulb that I turned on. It was a light bulb that somebody else turned on. So the very short version of, I guess, quite a long story was that when I was in Dubai running this large American business that I mentioned, I had arrived into that role, and it was, let's say, not quite as I had expected when I took that job. And the business needed significant turning around. And I was, quite honestly, extremely unprepared for that. I had come out of very corporate roles with, 15 people in finance, with, many leaders around you, a lot of people, a lot of support, and ended up in a role where I was very alone. It was a much smaller business, about 35 people. It was a very entrepreneurial role. But the truth was I had never been an entrepreneur. So I had no idea what I was doing. And in that period of, let's say, overwhelm, of just not knowing how to reapply very corporate skill sets to a very different environment, I met with a business coach and we had lunch. And in that conversation with her, she was asking me about my leadership style. And at the time, I was talking about intuition, being an intuitive leader. And she stopped me and she asked me a question, which in the end changed my life, because she said, Mimi, is it intuition or is it empathy? And Bill, at the time, I remember thinking, no, of course it's not empathy. What has empathy got to do with leadership or business? But that was, as you said, kind of the light bulb moment, because I left that lunch. I started to research what she might mean, what she was seeing in me that I had not seen in myself. And I discovered something called the empathy deficit. And, we often talk about the elephant in the room to talk about, an issue that no one's talking about. This felt more to me like a mountain in the room, because I felt like I had stumbled across this huge issue for our world, for our people, for our workplaces, and for our children, for everyone. And in 2019, nobody was talking about this. So I really made the decision, probably not as consciously as I now believe, but I made the decision to start talking about it. I thought, well, if no one else is, maybe I should. And so from that day on, life changed and I started talking about this. And of course, the work has evolved quite a lot since those days.
So you mentioned the empathy deficit. I'm fascinated by this concept, and you chart in your book, this is something that has developed over time. What would you see as the possible root causes of the empathy deficit? Where did this come from, and where did we start falling short in the area of empathy?
Look, it's the reality is that empathy has been declining for at least 30 years. And in those 30 years, we have lost 48% of our empathy. When you understand that empathy is a pro-social skill set, Bill, that means it keeps us alive. Right? This is not about thriving. You will thrive if you use your empathy, but this is about survival of the human race. And then you put that into context and say, but for 30 years, we have been letting it decline, steadily until the point that we've lost nearly 50% of it. There's many root causes of that lacking. Urbanization will be one of them. This mass fundamental migration over the last 100 years, where so many of us have left our roots, have left our villages, whether those are theoretical or real, villages. We've left those tribes of people that we grew up with, the places that we knew, whether it is the age of digitization, and of course now the expansion of AI in many ways is creating some of that disconnection. Whether it is stress. So today we have 380 million people with anxiety. 380 million, right? The reality is that the way that the brain functions is that when you are suffering with anxiety, stress, risk, fear, discomfort, any of these sort of risks to the human race, as it were, the way the brain accepts that, you can't actually access your empathy. The part of the brain where the empathy sits, the prefrontal cortex, needs you to be in a state of balance to be able to use that effectively. So when you're under very high pressure or very low time, which again, if we asked your audience today who has low time and high stress, I suspect most of them, right, are putting up their hand right now, that impacts it as well. So there's many parts of this. I think the final piece is just the belief of sort of performance above all else in the workplace. For many decades, that is what leaders have been focused on: process, people, performance, not necessarily the balance of our connectivity and belonging in those spaces. So it's quite multifaceted, and I think it's turning around slowly, but we do have a long way to go back.
Mimi Nicklin was facing one of the toughest challenges in her successful career as an executive when she began to feel alone and overwhelmed. When she thought she had an intuition about what to do next, a business coach asked her if this was intuition or empathy. Realizing it was the latter, a light bulb was lit in Mimi, and she has spent her time since studying the subject of empathy, understanding the empathy deficit in the world, which has been growing over the past 30 years, and now writing and speaking extensively on the subject. She says there are 3 drivers of the decline in empathy around the world, and they are urbanization, digitization, and stress. For more on this, let's get back to our conversation. When you say 30 years, I and others tend to point the finger at social media for a lot of the world's issues, and clearly 30 years ago that was not present. So let's put social media aside for a second. Some of this, it seems to me, can feel sort of counterintuitive. Like you say, moving to the cities. Well, when I think of cities, I think of a lot of people physically in physical proximity. You'd think there'd be a lot of connection. Or let's now jump in with social media, and the promise of social media was going to be connecting people, and we're finding it does almost the opposite. What is it, do you think, about that? Why are we not, as a species, it seems, able to use these platforms or the physical proximity to others to build these connections and greater empathy?
The challenge with connectivity is that it's about understanding. It's not about physical environment. So the reason I say that is, for example, if you look at loneliness, you can be lonely in a room full of people. In fact, most of us are, statistically 52% of us, right? So statistically, half of your listeners today, right now, are lonely. And I would guess that many of them are tuning into us today on a metro, on a bus, in a car. They're surrounded by people, right? So it is sort of the great paradox of our times that states, as you said, more of us are living in urban areas than ever before. We are in close proximity to so many people, and yet that connectivity is not there. I think social media is a slightly different part of that. As you said, many of us are very quick to blame social media, but the reality is it's just a platform. You can't blame a platform. You can only blame the people that use it, and that is us. So however you look at this, Bill, the only people we can blame is ourselves for this lack of connection. Now, a huge part of this disconnection comes from fear. And a lot of that fear is subconscious fear. So many of us are living in fear, some level of fear, nearly every day. And that is not fear that you necessarily recognize. It's not fear like, I'm going to fall off a cliff, very obvious fear, right? It's fear about politics. It's fear about the state of the economy. It's fear about getting fired from my job at 4 a.m. when they lock me out my email. It's fear about disease. It's fear about uncertainty. It's fear of a global pandemic, right? So In that way, social media does have a role to play, but perhaps in a slightly different one from potentially what you were mentioning earlier, which is that because we have access to 24/7 information, the human brain cannot process that, and nor is it meant to. If we wanted to right now at this moment, we could both pick up our phones and go onto TikTok and probably in some form of live stream watch children dying. The human being is not meant to witness that, right? Certainly not on tap 24/7. So this subconscious fear, this lack of connectivity, which is driven by segregation, is driven by anxiety, is a fundamental part of the psychology of the human race. When we feel fear, we retreat to light. And that is not because of bias or judgment or any of these things. It is evolutionary. I am safest in my tribe. That is what we know. So as we live in more and more fearful environments, people go back to what they know. And, in, I don't know, a city like New York, that's my apartment in my building with my Netflix. So yeah, it's a big concept with sort of small everyday moments that become that reality.
No, I think you've articulated that beautifully, and like you said, it's 24/7, and it's this global. We're inundated with information from around the globe. So I started by praising the technology that can allow me to talk to you today, and I still believe that. At the same time, technology is allowing us to see natural disasters and war and all these things going around the world, whereas back to our native villages, back in our earlier evolution, you worried about your family. You might worry about the people next door, maybe a 2-mile square radius of people. You didn't even know what was going on the other side of the world. And frankly, we're just not geared to handle it. So what advice do you give to people listening who feel that fear, who feel that overwhelming sense of doom? And I know you've also been an outspoken advocate for the power of optimism. So how, as you go and advocate for more empathy and better skills in these areas, what kind of practical advice do you offer?
So I think a big part of this lies in something called self-empathy. And self-empathy is not yet trending. So therefore, because we only seem to follow anything that's trending, many of your listeners will not have heard of it. They may have heard of self-love, self-care, self-compassion, self-awareness, many other selves. But self-empathy is fundamentally the ability to understand yourself. Because empathy at its core is a skill set, right? I touched very briefly. It's built into the prefrontal cortex of your brain. You have it. You were born with it. It is a skill set, not an emotion, right? So the ability to take the perspective of somebody else is a skill set. Self-empathy is the ability to use that for yourself. So in the modern day world, we talk, for example, in workplaces in the world, a lot about self-awareness. The challenge with self-awareness without self-empathy is that just acknowledging something, I know I feel anxious, that is self-awareness. I know it. I know I am suffering with anxiety. If I don't know why, i.e. self-empathy, understanding, then what? You're just going to stay anxious forever? Right? Awareness without insight is not a progressive state to remain in. So self-empathy, particularly in these times, is critical for people to be able to understand what they can, should, might not want to consume, for example. So a reference for that bill would be a couple of years ago. I remember making a very clear decision that for me, my choice, I will not watch the news anymore. Now, does that mean that at times I am more ignorant as to current affairs? Yes, right? Because maybe something happened in the last 2 hours, you might know and I don't, right? But in my self-empathy, I also know that that constant stream of bad news, of, terror, and I don't mean terrorism, but just terror in the world, is not helpful for me in doing this work. And I often remember telling my mother this. My mum, Bill, is a very traditional British older woman, right? And I told her this. I said, I'm not going to watch the news anymore. And she said in her very British accent, she said, well, darling, how can you possibly be the CEO and not watch the news? And I said to her very clearly, because Mum, I can't be the CEO and watch the news. It's too much for me. I can't get out of bed every day if I start with that. So That's a very small example of what self-empathy is, this ability to really understand yourself. Because in the end, we cannot change the behavior of others. And so much of our disappointment in life, so much of our distress and anxiety comes from this desire to shift the behavior of others, whether it's the president of your country or your friends or your husband. You cannot, because they are them and you are you. So self empathy is a really good skill to be able to understand yourself better within a system that you can't control fundamentally.
Well, I'm glad to hear you talk about your news consumption because I'm encouraging people to do something similar. You can stay informed, in democratic society, and it's important to be a citizen who knows what's going on, but you don't need to know it hour by hour, minute by minute. And people sometimes use batching strategies to answer emails. They'll only do it a couple times a day, let it build up. I would argue you can do the same thing with your news, and it doesn't have to be television. Read an online newspaper in the morning, and that's what your mom did growing up. That's what my parents did growing up. They didn't go to work and know every minute. And most of this news that you get every 2 hours, if not all of it, is completely out of your control. It's one thing to get a weather warning that there's a tornado coming towards your house and you need to get to the basement. But if there's something else that's completely out of your control, all it does is contribute to your anxiety. So I applaud you for that. And I wanted to underscore that. Mimi makes an important distinction when it comes to social media. We shouldn't blame the platform for how it makes us feel. It's really on us to manage our own behavior. She also says there's too much fear in the world, and this is one of the reasons why even in crowded cities, many of us still feel alone. And I loved her story about not watching the news. When she told her mom she'd started this practice, her mom responded with the question, "How can you be a CEO and not watch the news?" Mimi answered that in fact, she could not do both. Now, back to more of my blue sky conversation with Mimi Nicklin. There's something else you talk a lot about, and that is, and you do a lot of your work in businesses, for-profit organizations, or at least that's probably the majority of it. And you talk about balancing humanism and capitalism. And I'd like to dig into that a little bit because most of the people listening to this live in a capitalist society, and capitalism has been under attack of late. And the city of New York may be about to elect a mayor who would self-described not necessarily pure capitalist. Why is it hard to balance humanism and capitalism? And what advice do you give to people who are living in a capitalist society to embrace humanism in that world?
The funny thing is, so your question there, Bill, was why is it difficult to? And I would argue it's not, right? It's not difficult to balance humanism with capitalism. We just don't do it enough. So fundamentally, what we're talking, I'm never saying to people, don't make money, don't make double-digit growth. Please do make double-digit growth, right? We all should grow. To grow is part of the human condition. It motivates us, right? That is part of being human. When we don't grow, when we are stagnant, we don't do very well, right? In the worst cases, life ends. In the mediocre cases, we get very sick. And even at a very shallow case, we're very unhappy. So to grow, to build, to progress is part of who we are. And it's a phenomenal skill. But my work, my passion is to say, but how do you do that? Bringing your people with you versus, in the worst case, sort of trampling all over them whilst doing it. So fundamentally, what we're talking about is how do you make that profit, but in a way that doesn't disintegrate the well-being or the status of the people that are doing it. And I think that the faster the AI revolution takes hold of the world that we're living in, the more important this will be. Because as technology takes over so much of that capitalism, it makes your processes faster, it makes your systems smoother, it does algorithmic work that you couldn't get to before. So arguably, you can now be even more capitalist, you can make even more money, right? But we have to do that in a way that sustains the people that are in your business as well. Because the AI, the tech, will only ever be as strong as the people building it, using it, leveraging it. So the balance of humanism and capitalism is not a fight against capitalism. It's simply saying, look at the data. Organizations that have highly engaged, highly empathic cultures see 21% higher profits. You will make more money if you engage your people, 68% higher levels of engagement, 48% higher levels of innovation. There are no business drivers, Bill, that do not improve when we have more empathic, understanding cultures. And I am not talking about softness. I'm not asking you to be nice. Please be nice. Okay, it's good to be nice. But that's not what we're talking about here. So I think it's a lot of this conversation is about a fundamental reframing of the language, of what these terms mean, and of how you can be strong and growth orientated and performance driven whilst being an empathic leader. So I think there's a long way to go in what this discussion means, but fundamentally we're talking about building your business while protecting your people.
Yeah, and I appreciate the work you're doing, because it's not, like you said, these aren't sort of soft things. These aren't woo-woo, if you will. These are very basic. And that humanism, like you said, can drive success in a capitalist society, whereas a lot of people would think that they're at odds. You talk a lot about a very basic skill, but seems very elusive for a lot of leaders. You talk about listening-led leadership. I'd like to talk to you some more about that. Why is listening so important, and why aren't more leaders good at it?
The reason they're not good at it is because they don't know they're not doing it. So let me start there. So I do a lot of masterclasses around listening, which are fundamentally like extended keynotes. And often we will go to the tea break. So maybe we're 90 minutes in and we'll be getting our coffee and tea. And normally a man, but that's mainly because in the side of the world I am, there are more male leaders still. Normally a senior man will come up to me, VP or CEO or someone, and say, Mimi, I need to tell you something. And I say, yes, how can I help? And they say, I just realized I haven't listened to anyone in my entire life. And I say, don't worry, sir, you're not alone. It happens all the time. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it happens all the time, because what happens in these masterclasses and sessions that we're doing is, for the first time, people actually question, hang on a minute, am I listening to understand my wife, daughter, sister, husband? Or am I simply listening to reply to them, to fix what I'm hearing? So it's quite a fundamental shift when people really recognize that actually I might be hearing my people, my team, my board of directors, but am I really listening to them? Because they are very different skill sets. To hear is a passive reality, assuming you have physically good hearing. If I smash a glass right now, you can hear it. You didn't have to think about hearing it. You just can. It's passive. To listen is to decode information, insight, understand, which is fundamentally what empathy is. So the first part of your question, this is so important, is because you cannot empathize, you cannot understand someone if you don't ask, right? And so many of our challenges in our workplaces are based on either judgment or assumption, both of which are coming from a lack of listening. They're not necessarily bad things. I think we judge our judgment. We assume that assumption is a bad thing. But sometimes the leader's just under a huge amount of pressure, has seen this reality before, and therefore is quite fairly assuming he knows the solution. It doesn't make him or her wrong, but it also doesn't mean that they're listening, because our brains can only hear one voice at a time. And if you are hearing your own, you are not listening to mine. So it is the backbone to this. If you want more innovation, if you want more collaboration, if you want higher performing teams consistently over time, they have to do it together. And they can only do it together when they learn how to listen to each other. So that's why it's so fundamental.
It's fantastic. And I think one of the issues with not listening, and it's a trap you can do even in my situation right now, conducting an interview, is thinking of what you want to say next while the other person's talking. And I think I would challenge everyone listening to think about how often they do that. And back to online behavior, I think it's that on steroids. The pace of response, I've got to respond quickly. You can't respond as quickly as a lot of people respond if you're actually listening and processing to what was just said or typed or texted to you. You just can't. And another pet peeve of mine, if anyone's in an academic setting, is when someone's talking and other people have their hands raised, they're not listening. You can't listen with your hand raised. You are literally trying to get the teacher's attention or the professor's attention, and you're thinking about what you're going to say next. You're not even listening to what's happening. And I think you've really hit on something important. And if we all are honest with ourselves and stop and think about it, we don't listen anywhere nearly as well as we could.
And I think a huge amount of that comes to patience. And I have realized in the last maybe 2 years, so I believe I live with, if that's a phrase, I live with patience, I live in patience, I believe in it, right? So even now building this platform, you mentioned sort of social media and the speed of social media, right? People make the assumption all the time, Bill, that I want to scale, right? Because especially if you're in America, everybody wants to scale, right? I don't want to scale. Would I like to grow my impact? Yes. But do I want to scale my platform? No, because I don't need to do this tomorrow. This is a 10-year journey, not a 10-minute journey. And what I realized through these conversations is that perhaps the difference between my vision and some other people's visions is patience. And that is at the core of being able to show authentic listening. I think it's made up of two things. One is patience. The other is presence. Without those two things, very hard to be a good listener. And we don't have a lot of either of them, right? We're not very patient. We're rushing. You know, I want to open an Instagram page today and have 1 million followers tomorrow. I want to start my business now and succeed tomorrow. I want to do my job today and get promoted tomorrow. Well, guys, hang on. Well, where did we get this timeline from, right? So I think that the lack of those two things, the ability to be patient and the ability to be present, truly present, are skills that are really lacking in many of our teams and realities today.
And I think we're tolerating norms now that make this worse. I talked to a man named Paul Leonardi who's written a book called Digital Exhaustion. He talks about one of the reasons we get so exhausted is we've created these norms where if you email me and I don't respond within 5 minutes, let alone, I used to be a hero 30 years ago when I answered, my policy was to answer emails by the end of the day. Now, if you don't answer in 5 minutes, you're ghosting, you're not paying, you don't care about me. And you can't take all that in, truly listen, truly think about it, and respond thoughtfully in that time period. And I think we've set ourselves up for failure by these expectations. And you know, I would add to patience, I would add almost, you know, another P, pace or pacing. It's just like, slow it down. Remove these expectations. I am not ghosting you if I don't respond in 5 minutes. Trust me on this one.
And I think maybe just sort of thinking aloud, you know, your passion for optimism, it's probably, I'm thinking as I speak, but I think probably these things have a huge impact on our optimism, because if we are constantly in a rush, we are constantly trying to solve and wanting to solve and seeing things now, it must happen now, very hard to be optimistic in the moment, right? Because things don't get fixed in a minute, right? You have to be patient, right? I always remember that my dad used to say, good things come to those who wait, right? So maybe, I don't know, I have not given us enough strategic analysis, but perhaps that pace is also impacting our low optimism as well, Bill.
I think it absolutely is. And back to the news, as someone says, you know, bad news happens quickly, good news happens slowly, right? So bad news is these quick events, these headline grabbing things, and the things that are good in the world take a little time, you know, longevity and development of vaccines, all these things, they take a while and they don't make the news. So it all contributes. Mimi Nicklin is emphatic when she says that it is not hard to balance humanism and capitalism. And she says that business leaders need to bring people along with them. Even in this new age of AI, Mimi says technologies will only be as strong as the people using them. Businesses, she says, citing research, make significantly more money when they have an engaged workforce. And she goes on to point out that one of the simplest yet often difficult ways to motivate people is to listen to them, and to listen without thinking about what you're going to say next. This is a superpower if you can do it. Now, back to our final segment. Within your listening-led leadership, you have an acronym, ALUR. I don't know if you pronounce it ALUR or you call it ALUR, but I like this a lot because listening's in there as the L, but it's authenticity, listening, understanding, and recognition. So we've talked about listening. I'm a huge fan of authenticity in life and certainly in leadership because I think people can smell inauthenticity a mile away. But can we talk about ALUR and maybe walk through those, starting with authenticity?
Yeah, for sure we can. And, it's funny because a few years ago, I began to realize that HR predominantly, who are often my clients, they needed a framework. And I kept thinking, I don't have a framework. So I created one. And it was this one you're talking about, which I do call ALUR, mainly because I love the sound of the word, right? Who doesn't like the word ALUR, right? It's a beautiful word. But you're right. It stands for authenticity, listening, understanding, and recognizing. The authenticity, as you touched on there, has to come first. And we were talking about it a little bit earlier when we were talking about patience and presence, because those, for me, are the two fundamental pillars of showing authenticity. You touched on this as well. People can smell a fake, right? And the reality is, unfortunately, we are surrounded by fakes all the time. Not just the obvious fakes, the AI fakes on Instagram and all these things, right? But just people that come up to you in a networking event and go, "Hi, it is so nice to meet you. Yes, goodbye." You didn't mean that. Like, why did you even bother? So connectivity, which is fundamentally what empathy is part of that ecosystem, has to start with authentically having an intention to connect. If you don't have time for me, that's fine, but don't pretend you do, right? Because the pretending is far more damaging than they're not doing. And I would take that out of the workplace and put it into parenting as well, right? If you do not have time to listen to your child right now, don't do it half-heartedly. Because you know what you're doing? You're damaging your relationship. You're creating distance. Because next time when they do need to talk to you, they're going to think, she's probably not going to listen, right? So that's why the A is so important. The L, obviously, we've touched on quite a bit already, which is listening, and that active, intentional skill set. The only thing I would add to that is that people seem to think it takes a long time. So the biggest pushback I get from leaders is, "But Mimi, I don't have time." And the answer to that is that you can listen really well in under 90 seconds. And I do it in my masterclasses. I do a little exercise with people. In less than 90 seconds, you can create connection. So this is not always about listening to people, share their life story. The U is understanding, fundamentally curiosity. And that is also beginning to enter the business lexicon now. You'll see it in HBR and Forbes. Curiosity-led leadership and curiosity in culture. Fundamentally open-ended questions, delving deeper, looking for insight, confirming understanding. So, Bill, I heard you say this. Did I understand you correctly? Moving away from assumption. And I'll give you a really nice example of this. So I was in London a few months ago, and in London, there are quite a few homeless people, so people who live on the street. And at one point, a friend and I, we went into a grocery store, and there was a homeless person on the street. And the lady I was with went in, and she bought him a sandwich and a Coca-Cola. And when she came out, she gave these to the homeless man, and he looked at them, and then he gave back the sandwich. And of course, she was like your face, just like, why? And she sort of said, and she said to him, "But I thought you were hungry." And he said, "I am hungry, but I'm also vegetarian." Right? The gap between sympathy and empathy, the gap between assumption and understanding. So we go through life, and it's often very well intentioned, like the story, but we're not really understanding, we're assuming. So that's why we have the U, and the R, which is recognition. Fundamentally, as human beings, we live for recognition from childhood, right? This is why children say, "Mummy, watch. Mummy, look at me. Mummy, look at me," over and over again for like 7 years, right? We need to be seen. We need to be acknowledged. We need to be recognized. So probably the most powerful word in the human race is thank you, right? So there's many forms of recognition in the organizational world, but Fundamentally, this is based on acknowledgement over action. So helping leaders understand your job is not always, sometimes, but not always to fix, right? People are so desperate to be acknowledged that the life coaching industry is predicted to be worth over $1 trillion by 2030. People are so desperate to be heard, they will pay you to listen, right? So that's how that model works. It's the fundamental steps to creating connection. You don't always have to do all 4 in a row, and they don't take an hours-long deep dive into, your family history. These things can be done quite efficiently in meetings, in everyday life, in the coffee shop. But they do take intentional commitment to do so.
Fantastic. And I'll underscore a couple things there. Recognition. So I've told the story on the show before, and it's not about bragging about me, but it's to show how simple this can be. So when I was running an organization, it was a television network. And when people particularly produced a great promo or, did anything that was just sort of exceptional, I learned this from my boss. I would handwrite a note and put it in the interoffice mail. Simple. Hey, great job on the blah, blah, blah. It would take me 30 seconds, a minute. I maybe did 15 minutes a week on these. And one time I had written one to someone, and then weeks later I was walking the halls and we had cubicles, those soft-sided cubicles, and I'm talking to this person, and out of the corner of my eye, I see my note pinned to her cubicle. And it totally threw me, but it drove home. It took me, again, 30 seconds to write that note, and it was pinned to her cubicle. So if anyone wonders whether or not recognition matters, I always remember that story. And another thing I'd add is you mentioned someone said, well, I don't have time to do all this listening. I would argue that the time wasted as a byproduct of not listening, of follow-up, of misunderstanding. Wait, could you send me that email again? I didn't really read it carefully. Can you, all of that, it's like, get it right. Measure once, measure twice, cut once, listen once. And right. Do you see that in your work?
Yeah, for sure. And one of the biggest stats I use, which is associated with Gallup, is that every year we lose an estimated $8.8 trillion in perceived loss due to 3 key areas: disengagement, disconnection, and presenteeism, right? So I absolutely agree. There is a very, very real cost to not listening to people, to just not valuing them, right? People just don't feel that they're interested, right? So if you imagine that today, especially in America, 52% of people are thinking of resigning. 75% of the 52% are resigning because their boss doesn't listen to them, right? They have no relationship with their boss. And then just think for a moment, whether you have 5 people in your team or 5,000 or 50,000, imagine if 52% of them walked out, right? Imagine the cost, imagine the stress, imagine the recruitment budget, right? You literally cannot afford to continue to not listen to your people because they will walk with their feet. So I absolutely agree. I think there is a very clear associated cost with that lack of engagement, and we need to fix it really quite quickly.
So Mimi, you're a force on all of these issues, and you mentioned masterclass. I know you do public speaking. Can you, as we approach the end here, can you talk about the range of work that you're doing on this? You've written books. Let's talk about Mimi Nicklin and her empathy empire, and what is the range of activities that you engage in that people might tap into if they're interested?
I love the idea of an empathy empire.
Not bad.
I think I might steal that.
Go. I don't have it. Go.
I'm going to put that on my cubicle.
Yes,
right?
I like
it. The one that I don't have, I'm going to put your note on.
I like it.
So the empathy empire is made up of predominantly keynote speaking. So I spend the majority of my life on a plane, Bill. And yes, I do passionately speak on stages every week around the world, talking to organizations and events and teams around the power of empathy and why we need it in our leadership and in our world, and why we need it in the age of AI fundamentally. So how we balance not just the humanism and capitalism that we were speaking about earlier, but the humanism and the tech, basically. But yes, I have just finished my 4th book, actually. So even though my 3rd is not out, my 3rd is coming out in December. It's called The Connection Prescription. And you touched on longevity earlier. That book really focuses on the role of empathy and belonging in longevity. And I do masterclasses and quite a lot of work with the media as well. So Yeah, anything fundamentally that creates more empathy. I believe that the more the world talks about empathy, the more empathy the world will have. So anytime there's an outlet, just like your podcast today, so thank you. I take that opportunity to help a handful more people understand what this skill set is and why our world needs it so much.
Fantastic. I would put empathy as one of those things. I talk about gratitude a lot and its connection to optimism. I think empathy is right there. And you mentioned curiosity, which is also right there. If you're always curious, there's always more to learn. You wake up optimistic because it gives you something to get out and do. And everybody knows something that you don't. So I learned a lot from you today, Mimi, and from your work. And I really appreciate, I know how crazy busy you are to take this time on the other side of the globe to talk to me. So thank you very much.
You are more than welcome. I feel more optimistic just having spent the hour with you. So thank you very much for having me.
All right, go get them. Thank you. Mimi's story about the friend buying the person a sandwich is a powerful one. Even when we have the very best of intentions, assumptions can get in our way, and it's incumbent upon all of us to try to understand before we begin to assume. This practice, along with the others recommended by Mimi, will go a long way towards our ability to shrink the empathy gap that's costing us all so much. I hope you enjoyed this blue sky conversation with Mimi Nicklin. Before you go, we'd appreciate you leaving us a rating or review, and hope you'll consider subscribing to our podcast to be sure you don't miss any future episodes. This and all Blue Sky episodes are made possible by the amazing editing and mixing done by the team at Sound On, Sound Off. You can learn more about their work at soundonsoundoff.com. All graphic design and cover art for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute are provided by Crush Graphics. That's Crush with a K, if you'd like to check out more of their fantastic work at crushgraphics.com. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.